Jennifer Altman is actually visiting us from, I think it's London. Jennifer has been on the editorial board of Nature. She has a BA from Oxford and a PhD from University College London, and has a great interest in the topics that we've been discussing. And we've asked her to give some comments on her insights. Prior to the conference, actually, she had written a very interesting review and her insights into these topics. So she's going to just chat with us for about 10 minutes about some of her thoughts and views. So Jennifer, if you'd like to come up.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's been, for me, a very exciting and stimulating conference, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have been able to take part. It seems to me that we're on the cusp of a real paradigm shift, at least in the neurosciences, and it's been wonderful to hear people actually speaking from the heart about their own experiences, which in my experience is very unusual in any sort of academic meeting. I also have a real personal reason to be grateful to be here. In the last 15 years, I've been living a split life, where part of my time I work as a neuroscientist and as a science writer, and the other part of my time I work as a therapeutic healer, working with body energy healing, and I have quite a substantial client practice. And although I can talk about neuroscience to my fellow healers, I've never been able to talk about my healing activities to my fellow neuroscientists, because there's always been a feeling that I would totally lose credibility if I did. And here it's been wonderful to find an environment where these things are talked about openly and where I can actually come out. Thank you. So the comments I want to make today are basically from my experience as a healer, working on the shop floor, if you like, in a discipline that requires a high degree of empathy and compassion. And one of the things that I feel has been missing in this meeting is an input from psychotherapeutic disciplines, because psychotherapy is perhaps the main Western tradition of working with compassion and empathy. And we can learn a lot, I think, from talking to psychotherapists about the way, particularly on an educational side, about the way that they train and the way that they work. And also about a lot of the insights that they have into human behavior. I was talking to one of my psychotherapy colleagues, in fact I gave her a copy of my paper to read, and she put me onto an organisation in Britain at the University of Derby called the Compassionate Mind Foundation, which has been set up by a man called Paul Gilbert to promote well-being through the scientific understanding and application of compassion. And I feel that this is an organisation that perhaps CCARE should get in contact with. It was set up in 2006, so it has a sort of parallel development to your own. And Paul Gilbert has written a book called The Compassionate Mind, in which he explores how our minds have developed to survive in dangerous and threatening environments by becoming sensitive and quick to react to perceived threats. This sometimes can lead to problems in how we respond to life's challenges. And scientific evidence has demonstrated that compassion towards oneself and others can lead to an increased sense of happiness and well-being, particularly valuable when we're feeling stressed. And he has developed something that he calls compassionate mind training. Now, I've only had an opportunity to look at his website. I don't know any details of the training. But the blurb from the website says, an innovative approach which is likely to grow in importance over the next decade as evidence for its benefit continues to build. A comment from the president of the British Association for Behavioural and Cognitive Psychotherapies. So it seems to me that this Compassionate Mind Foundation is probably a good liaison for CCARE in the psychotherapeutic domains, that they are looking at how to train compassion, not just among therapists, but in the general public, partly as a way of promoting health. Now, I think the emphasis in this meeting has been very much, at least yesterday afternoon and today, on compassion as a trigger for charitable giving. I want to draw your attention in these few minutes to the other dimension of compassion, which is very important in our society, and that is in therapeutic relationships. The relationship, particularly, I think, between clinicians and their patients, and between therapists and clients, which is a very important aspect of our culture today. The other point I want to make is, or discuss briefly, which picks up on something that Jim said before coffee, is to what limits compassion, what stops us being compassionate. And I think there are two aspects here that I'd like to emphasize. One is on the group level, and the other is on the personal level. I would like to introduce you, if you haven't already come across him, to the work of a German psychotherapist, family therapist called Bert Hellinger, who has set up a form of work called family constellations, or systemic constellations. And he calls himself a practical philosopher. The work is phenomenological. And one of his important insights, I think, that has come out of this work is the idea of group conscience. That when you act within your group, along the movement that is current in your group, you can act in a guilt-free manner against people outside your group. And this, I think, is a very useful insight into how we can behave absolutely atrociously to people who are strangers to us, when we can be very compassionate to people who are familiar to us. And I think Hellinger's ideas are very, very far-reaching. One thing that I think comes out of his work is the idea, which is often preached in many religions, about loving our enemies, that in fact this is an absolute contradiction, because as long as you see somebody as an enemy, you don't see them as a human being. And one of the absolute bases of compassion is that you respond to another person as a human being. So when you cut off from that humanitarian response to somebody else, that allows you to behave in atrocious ways. And I think we see this many times over in the world today. I don't want to name any specific incidences, but there have been plenty in the last couple of years. So I think the group conscience and this dehumanizing of the other, which Hellinger sees as going back to a very old tribal response, is one very significant factor at work in the world today. On a more personal level, we all have experiences, both of our own and those coming from our families, which determine the way that we behave. And a lot of these reactions, I should call them, are, unless we've done a lot of reflective practice, are unconscious. Some forms of psychotherapy identify these as object relations. There's also an analogy to the crocodile that lurks in the mud of our brainstems, which can suddenly erupt in a very destructive way when we're put into certain situations. And I think both these object relations and this lurking crocodile affect the way that we respond compassionately to other people, because other people's suffering triggers in us memories of our own suffering, often memories that we don't know that we have. And as these memories are evoked, they cause reactions that we have no control over. And it's only through self-reflection, reflective practice, and really, I think as we've heard a lot today about the Buddhist forms of meditation, over the last couple of days about the Buddhist forms of meditation, there are many such practices that have developed which can help us to identify the problems that we have ourselves that stop us responding with compassion to other people. And if we're looking at education in compassion, I think we have to be aware of these hidden factors and ways of helping people to identify them. One last point is about differentiating compassion into what I call common compassion, which is what we all experience. And I think that common compassion is very limited by these hidden experiences and can very much limit our responses, the way that we respond, not just where we find we cannot respond, or we respond with anger or aggression or violence, but also why sometimes we over-respond. We try to rescue the person who we perceive to be suffering, even if perhaps they don't necessarily want to be rescued. But with reflective practice of whatever type we use, we can come closer to what I've called objective compassion, for want of a better term, which enables us to stand back from suffering, to see suffering for what it is, to broaden our identification out from our own group to the needs of all humanity, to see people outside our own group as humans, and to spread it even further into the conditions of the world in general, seeing perhaps the world as the planet as a living organism and how our behavior affects that. I'd like to see some discussion about this distinction, and Jim Park called it higher compassion. I think one of the definitions we need is a good term for this broader form of compassion that is less self-centered, less reactive, and more responsive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And actually, it does bring up a point that we have been commenting on compassion in the context of, if you will, well, perhaps people without compassion are not normal, but sort of the normative situation. But we really haven't focused on compassion in the context of people with a variety of different affective disorders, and in the context of either medical practitioners or psychologists or clinical psychologists. So I think that's really an interesting point, and it's one that deserves thought, especially when one of our missions is education, and it's not just education of what we, I think, would call those in the normal population, but also perhaps giving tools to individuals who may be outside that border of what we would consider normal, but in fact have different conditions which impair them from a variety of interactions. So thank you, Jennifer. So what I'd like to do now is to open up the conference to questions. And hopefully, all you guys have been thoughtful and deliberative. So I think Philippe is already standing there, so please.
Actually, this is a question for Thupten Jinpa and Jennifer, apropos because I think we've talked about like other oriented compassion. I'm glad you brought up the therapeutic relationship, clinical psychologist and neuroscientist. But self-compassion, generating compassion for oneself, i.e. the opposite of low self-esteem, and a lot more, as a basis for being able to demonstrate compassion for other, definitely therapist-client, perhaps physician-client, patient. But I'm also wondering for Thupten Jimala to actually elaborate from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition the sequence of developing compassion for the self, for one's own self, as a basis, or whether that is a basis or not, for developing genuine, great compassion for others. So so I'd like the two of you to talk about that.
Yes, I didn't actually mention that, but it is in my paper that in order to develop true compassion for others, first of all, you have to be able to be compassionate for yourself. And that's often a very difficult process.
If you look at the Buddhist traditional compassion practices, most of them kind of presuppose that you have actually done that bit. In fact, you have actually done that bit of kind of having cultivation of, I mean, self-compassion is a problematic term in Buddhist language because compassion is defined as other-focused. We can say a sense of caring for oneself, a sense of love, or concern for oneself, because there's the term we use for compassion is karuna, which is a technical term, but we have a more generic term, anukampa or tsewa, which can be directed to oneself and others. So that's a more basic level of a sense of caring and concern. And the understanding here is that if you do not have a sense of caring for yourself, a love for your own self and your own sense of concern, then you don't have the basis to be able to empathize with others' suffering. So therefore, you cannot genuinely feel for the other's pain. So maybe John Dunn, you want to add something, and after that, I wanted to pick up on this question that was thrown out this morning as well, but also yesterday with Bill Newsom about the whole question of whether we should worry about the fact that the reward part of the brain system lights up when you do altruistic activity. Is that pure altruism or impure altruism? Whether we should worry about it or whether we are making a category mistake, as philosophers would call it. I would like to see that question brought up, but I'll John Dunn, if you want to add something.
And actually, I think that the question you just raised relates here, because I think we had a certain degree of definitional clarity and agreement yesterday that I think has slowly eroded. And we are now using terms like altruism and compassion in somewhat, I would say, out of love, I hope, in somewhat muddled ways. And actually this specific term, self-compassion, is a very good example of that, because I'll even be more direct about it, less Tibetan, so to speak, and say that it's an oxymoron, terminologically, from the Buddhist standpoint, to say self-compassion doesn't make any sense. Now, what I think that also points to a cultural issue, which is very important. What you find is that in the United States, most teachers of, let's say, mindfulness styles or practices emphasize the need for something like self-compassion. And I think that's because we have a cultural phenomenon here where essentially we don't think we deserve to be happy. And that notion culturally just makes almost no sense in a Tibetan context, that you don't deserve to be happy or you don't like yourself. I mean, of course, I'm sure there's some kind of affective disorders or what have you in which that would arise in a Tibetan context, but as a cultural notion, it's really very odd. So there's no word for low self-esteem. The idea of having low self-esteem is also very difficult to communicate in Tibetan. Now, all of this goes to say that we need a clearer definition of compassion, and I'd love to see someone follow up on Jimpala's question, and if I can elaborate just a tiny bit on that. What I would say is we need to distinguish between activity that is voluntary and knowingly leading to another's benefit, that's an activity. And then the intentionality, apparent or not apparent to the agent engaged in that activity, and its effective tone. And those are all separate issues, actually, from a Buddhist standpoint. So you could have an activity that's deliberately, a voluntary activity that is knowingly going to lead to another's benefit, but the intention is to avoid blame. And the effective tone is guilt. So when a person in a dictator game is about to, is so to write sorry, just as an example, I wouldn't say probably there's no compassion going on at all there.
I don't think there's any sorrow going on there. I think that's just a place setting to justify your behavior, but certainly by my definition of sorrow.
So, but what is going on there is a big question. So I just would like to, I think that relates to this issue of definition.
So, first of all, I was very impressed by all three presentations from the economists and the psychologists here. And I very much really liked your citation of Nagel's definition of altruism. Which was Jim's, yeah. And so I think here, when we talk about pure altruism versus impure altruism and the whole question of, warm glow and the reward side of the brain lighting up and all of this, I sometimes worry a little bit, because the thing is, whether we like it or not, science, and particularly anything that has neural basis, has a big cachet in popular society. And when, it's one thing to see these in very exclusive scientific publications which are read by only the experts who have the nuance to be able to read these in the way in which they should be read. But it is something else when they come out in, say, Newsweek or Time magazine or, popular press, and then people say, well, there is no such thing as pure altruism, because even the person who's doing this charitable act is getting something in return. And this reminds me of quite a bit of a cultural shock. When I first went to study at Cambridge in 1989, I remember having a very heated conversation with some of my friends. I was in philosophy department, and a lot of these friends were dead serious. There's no such thing as pure altruism. And I remember having this long argument about Mother Teresa's activity, and their insistence was she must be getting something out of this. So, the point I'm trying to raise here is that there is a certain moral responsibility here on the part of the scientist and the economist. And I know that for the scientist, or sometimes they say that, our job is to pursue the knowledge, and how the knowledge is applied is really up to the society. It's not for us. But the fact remains that people really interpret. So it may end up reinforcing cynicism in society. So therefore, I think it's helpful to have a clarity. For example, when we talk about selfishness versus altruism, we're really talking at the level of conscious intent. And, if a person's intention is to help the other, and that is the ultimate aim of that, action, then in the process, whether the person benefits or not in terms of joy or whatever, that is secondary. That shouldn't. So, and the the reward part of the brain letting up and so on, I don't think that should undermine the fact that the act is altruistic. Now, the Kantian form of pure altruism is something else. That may be a very complex question. And even in, say, for example, in the Hindu tradition, in the Bhagavad Gita, there is a very famous scene where Arjuna is just about to kill all the cousins in front of him in the battle, and he's worrying about the karmic consequences of his act. And Krishna, the god, tells him that the purest form of act is the act done out of duty with no consideration of the consequences of an act. So it's kind of Kantian model is there even in the Bhagavad Gita. So that may be a complicated question, but it would be helpful to have some clarity on the definition of altruism versus egoism, so that we do not raise the bar too high so that altruisms are only heroic acts. So I would like to have some discussion on this, particularly from the neuroeconomists.
Is there a distinction? We are putting altruism to some extent in the context of a moral framework. So if you have that term, what is philanthropy? Is in some senses, is that altruism with intent? Is it the same? Any comments?
Our goal to define what compassion is, and I think when Jinpa just talked about sort of and John, the inherent nature from a Buddhist perspective of compassion being other-centered, I think that one thing that a number of people have mentioned is the importance of culture. And I think that when we talk about compassion in Western contexts, we have an idea of the self as very individualistic and independent. And so we make lots of distinctions between the self and other people. I think in lots of the presentations it makes sense because we're studying Americans. But I would like us as a group, and other members of other Western cultures, but I would like us as a group to think about the larger context of many Buddhist contexts or East Asian contexts, and the notion of the self is more collectivistic, more connected with others. So that means that a lot of the compassionate acts or altruistic acts may not be defined specifically in terms of giving to people who are unrelated to us. I mean, if you have a notion of the self that's more interconnected, then maybe what you're doing is you're giving to your family members because you see that, or you're giving to the temple, and you're seeing these people as part of you, right? So and if they're part of you, you're benefiting in some way, even though it's other focuses. So I think that's an important thing to remember when we're trying to define compassion and we're trying to operationalize it in our paradigms. And I'd be just interested in what other people think about that.
Jinpa said about the dangers of looking at self-interest as a motivation for compassionate acts. And I guess I think I disagree with you because I think that in the end, these motivations are the source of everything that people do. I mean, I'm not saying that people are narrowly self-interested, but people have some goal in mind, and they make choices to advance that goal. And when they've advanced that goal, they feel happy about doing that. And I don't see anything uncompassionate about that. I think that the compassionate behavior is very complex, and we've seen a little bit about that, the motives can be very sophisticated and very interesting and sort of meaningful in and of themselves. But at the end of the day, it doesn't, I want to sort of hear what other people have to say to this, but it just doesn't bother me that compassionate acts are motivated by my desire to make myself feel better at the end of the day. That almost seems like something we should take advantage of rather than something we should, try to argue against.
Compassionate feelings are motivating altruistic giving, and I would probably take a Buddhist stance in that perspective, that I think to know whether it was a compassionate feeling, you should ask the person whether they really felt compassion and whether the intention was really out of a mixture of motivation and feeling, if that's the definition of compassion. Because as I believe Ulrich Meyer showed in his data, the strongest predictor of this giving was social norms and other factors. So, factors of fairness, factors of social norms, and I think you should probably distinguish these motivation. Perhaps they result in the same outcome, it's giving to others, but the motivation underlying that. And I think activation in nucleus accumbens will not tell us whether it was a social norm or whether it was compassion or whether it was empathy or something else driving this. Yeah. And I think the only way we have actually is to ask the subjects through phenomenology. I don't think we have another way to do that.
I wanted to follow up on the several points that have been made, and particularly Tanya's last point, which I think is important. And just reflecting on the presentations that we heard this morning, one of the characteristics of each one of those presentations was the quite significant heterogeneity among the participants in their behavior. And one of the, I think, jewels in the data that we heard presented is potentially contained within the outliers. That is, those individuals who are, so for example, in the data that we heard comparing accumbens activation during I forget the exact manipulation, but it was whether it was benefiting self versus other, and using that to, in some sense, define a neural altruist. To look at those individuals who are really naturally extreme in their responses, and to learn more about who they are. And in some sense, I think what our interest is in with respect to this more specific domain is not in just altruism per se, but in altruists. And I think that by exploring more about the lives of these people, we can potentially learn something about what the conditions are that may have given rise to them behaving in the way that they're behaving, including asking them the kinds of questions that Tanya is describing, which I think is important.
There was a show on TV where there was an individual who had this amazing ability to sort of distract people and then do various activities. And one of these was he went into a store and began a fast conversation and then picked up an item and said, "Thank you very much, you can keep the change." And he never paid the man. And then he walks out and the man doesn't. And then he's standing there a little later and it shows the man trying to figure out what events had happened. And they then set up an experiment whereby they took two marketing individuals and basically the fellow met with them and said, "I'm going to make a prediction that within 90% certainty I will tell you exactly the marketing presentation you will give me." And he gave him a very general thing, but he very specifically said, "But I will show you what you're going to show me." And it shows, but you only have 2 hours to make your presentation. And the people came in from the airport. It shows actually a camera following them all the way to the event. And then these individuals made their marketing presentation. And I can't remember the specifics, but basically involved dinosaurs and food and how certain foods make you as strong as a dinosaur, something ridiculous. But the guy before the people had come in had put his own stuff there that he was going to show to them. And in fact, when he opened the thing, it was essentially identical to what these marketing people had come up with their brilliance, of which they're very high-level marketing people. And these people were just bowled over, thought it was extraordinary. How was this possible to do? And then it goes back and it shows every event that occurred along the path as they were doing this to get to the place to make their presentation, as far as every cue that they gave. Like there was a fight at a corner where they had stopped, and that was put into this. There was some kids playing on a corner with dinosaurs. There was a sign about something about food and its texture. And every one of those had been incorporated into their marketing plan. And they absolutely refused to believe that that was possible until they were shown the video. And it goes back to this point of the effect of these subtle cues and how dramatic they can have in terms of an impact on an individual's behavior who logically should be thinking rationally, and it shouldn't even come into your mind. But in fact, it has a huge impact. And while I wouldn't be a manipulative sort, but I would say, I mean, is it justifiable to use every one of these to, I mean, the marketing people have become, now, is there neuromarketing? I think I saw something about that now. But I mean, that's potentially where this is heading, where people are taking this reality and manipulating it for good or evil. So that's just simply, Bill?
When Jim and I were in the car coming down from Darmstadt, he told me the story of the possibility, of the real everyday life of people confronted with suffering, reaching out and helping and having all the autonomic features that one can imagine, and how at the same time being able to be an excellent practitioner of that, to go to that voluntarily, took many thousands of hours of practice. So we've talked a lot about what's the brain look like on compassion and what cultivates compassion. And I really believe that there's a fundamental biological basis to that that's part of our evolution, back to Darwin. But obviously, the limits to compassion, those things that prevent us from being compassionate, are also part of our evolutionary history. So as important, I think, as understanding the brain basis for compassion is the brain basis for inhibition of compassion. You know, why is it, back to Jennifer's comment, why is it that my tribe on Saturday morning in the fall are people from Nebraska? And when I see Nebraska football players crash into those guys from Colorado, I say, good. But if in fact the Colorado guys and the Nebraska guys are playing Oklahoma, I'm cheering for Colorado. You know, there was a story that, you know, during the Cold War, the only thing that really could solve the Cold War would be some giant spaceship coming, and suddenly the Americans and the Russians would be best friends. So what is it about my tribal brain that prevents me from more readily reaching out to others, other cultures, for that matter, other animals, for that matter, rocks? I mean, what is it about my evolution that makes it so imperative that I survive? I think if we could figure that out, we'd probably figure out why the warm glow works so well. Because the warm glow, ultimately, is about me. It's about me feeling good about keeping my social group, my social setting stable and rewarding, and ultimately allowing me to pass my DNA on, even if I'm very old, as was pointed out yesterday by Brian Knudsen. Now you? Okay, anyway, somebody told me that. It was Joel, that tall guy. So I think the neuroscience of this and the psychology of this goes together. If we ignore our biological underpinnings, we'll only learn half the story. And I just think for a moment, is behavior the most important readout? And I think it can't be, because the behavior that arises, if we're really interested in promoting well-being, will be behavior that comes from the compassionate brain as opposed to the brain that is seeking an unfair advantage over another by appearing to be compassionate.
David?
Yeah, the word compassion is from the Latin to suffer with. That's really what it means. So I think the direct answer to the Mother Teresa question is even if you get a nucleus accumbens rush from feeling connected with humanity, you're also opening yourself to feeling humanity's suffering. And so there is certainly as much pain as pleasure in it. So the idea that you're simply doing it to get pleasure doesn't fit with what the phenomenon is. The converse example, I'm thinking of René Girard, the brilliant philosopher here at Stanford, who has pointed out that the two biggest problems he thinks mankind has is, number one, that we allow one another to substitute pleasures. That is, that we get convinced that we need to acquire rather than affiliate, that we get remote from our own actual reinforcement systems, and we allow other people to make us think we want things we don't want. And the other is scapegoating. So we, in a sense, dehumanize ourselves, and then we form these kind of tribal groups that Bill is describing. So I think one of the lessons is that we need to be truer to our own reinforcements of all kind, which include being positive to others. And if we get remote from that within ourselves, it's easier to dehumanize others because we're dehumanizing ourselves.
Specifically responding to you in some of the other comments, these philosophical questions about is it true altruism or not have been raging for centuries. And I do think that the neuroscientific evidence, as crude as it may be at this point, does have the potential to provide some clarity, because if we can really determine the biological mechanism, be true to our biological inheritance, so to speak, and understand those constraints, as I try to say in my talk, some of these discussions may simply go away. Because if it's really the fact, and I think a lot of people can agree on that, that motivations are important, and if it's a fact that motivations cannot be fulfilled without the sense of reward, then really the only question that is left is, what is this motivation directed to? And I think we have very clear evidence that there are instances where motivation is directed to the other. And why shouldn't that be altruism? And just one more aspect why I think we should actually be happy about the fact that we see reward activity, because we shouldn't forget that reward activity is there for a purpose. It's not just to make us happy, it's there to train us, So the fact that reward activity is associated with doing good things, carries a lot of potential for, the other goal of this endeavor, namely the pedagogical. It has a real pedagogical implication, something we can work with.
Like Jim and Gary, I'm a neurosurgeon. Unlike them, I don't practice any longer. So it's been an eye-opening 2 days, and I've got 20 questions, but I'll try and limit the comments to 2. One was from yesterday. We spent a lot of time talking about heroic compassion. And I found that interesting because sort of from an evolutionary point of view, heroic compassion could be termed a pathologic condition. Pathology being defined as it eliminates the host organism. If you're heroic, and your genes don't survive. So it's curious as to how that concept would promulgate itself. The second one was in regard to something that Dr. Knudsen was talking about today, and that is his sequence of localization to prediction to theory modification. And I would add sort of a branch arm in there that I think is food for investigation, and that is ultimately, if the work of this group bears fruit, there's going to be a desire to do some kind of functional modification. How do we come up with ways of modifying the function and behavior of individuals? It needs to be easily accessible, and it needs to be wide-ranging. Certainly sticking everybody in the world in a functional MRI unit in order to be able to change their behavior is not something that's going to be rational. Certainly spending 30,000 hours learning how to meditate and is not going to be something that's rational as well. And one of the things that I wanted to throw out for consideration and perhaps potential future research is that we've talked a lot about the nucleus accumbens and its involvement in the reward circuit. And there's a body of work that's been done and developed over the past couple of decades looking at music and its ability to activate the nucleus accumbens. We sort of saw this yesterday morning and at dinner the night before when we had music played to us and we all had the reactions that we did. And so I'd like to throw out the idea of looking how to use perhaps music tuned to individuals as a system primer, as a pump primer, to be able to activate that area and then condition it to whatever the intervention is that we're trying to achieve as a means that individuals could potentially practice on a regular basis on their own outside of a research environment.
If I could go back to this question of definition, if you don't mind, sorry, just to follow up on that, since that was one of our purposes here. I think we may have a slight issue here that is obscuring the question of whether or not an activity that results in some kind of reward could be either altruistic or compassionate. And there are 2 things. One of them is, and this is a question for you all, if your nucleus accumbens is activated, do you know it? Do you notice it? And if it is, in other words, from a first-person perspective, if your nucleus accumbens is being activated, is that detectable? Now, if it's sometimes detectable and sometimes not, if it's then how do we know when it's been detected? Because the reason for this, the problem that we have here is that we are assuming that the activation of a neuronal structure, of a brain structure that is connected to a reward circuit at a possibly preconscious level is somehow indicative of whether or not a person who's engaged at in conscious voluntary activity is getting a conscious, phenomenally available reward.
But I think you can create a argument that in fact the answer to your question is yes. Nucleus accumbens generates natural opioid release. The individual is positively rewarded from a feeling point of view related to that activity. They become conditioned over time to do things, interventions, acts that cause that stimulation.
No, what I mean here is not that there is some kind of establishment at the level of, let's say, brain chemistry of associations that are going to guarantee that a certain behavior is going to be eventually repeated, but rather that from a phenomenal perspective, when I engage in this activity and my nucleus accumbens goes off, does it feel good? If it's the case that an activity which is pleasurable That if I engage in an activity and it results in pleasure occurring, which would be the response might be, this goes off and there's some kind of phenomenally detectable pleasure as a result of this going off, then no compassion, it can't be altruistic. And if that means that can't be an altruistic activity, then compassion cannot be altruistic from a Buddhist standpoint because compassion feels good. So I think we're in a series, from my point of view, it seems like we're in a series of strange, we're talking phenomenally and then third person, we're talking about connecting, we're confusing the result of, deliberately seeking the result of an activity as being a reward, as opposed to the fact that a certain emotional state feels good. I mean, so I think we have a lot of...
Here's some data points. We're not the only animals that have nucleus accumbens. Or this circuit. You know, monkeys have it, rats have it, dogs have it, and so forth. There's a whole lot of research to suggest that if you stick a tube in there and dump dopamine in there, in a rat, or a dog or monkey, it'll move forward, it'll make reward anticipatory vocalizations, it will orient, it will show high, autonomic arousal, etc. Okay, now we can have an argument about whether the dog knows that its nucleus accumbens was activated, the rat, or whatever, but the point is that it's possible that this thing can be activated and generate behavior or promote behavior even without conscious phenomenological awareness of a state that has clearly been induced behaviorally being produced, okay? So we don't need to have the phenomenological link. Now, the other part of your question, though, is do people have phenomenological access? Can they have phenomenological access to that, okay? And in answer to that, I would say, okay, we have actually, in experiments that I didn't mention, cued people to anticipate that they would make money or avoid losing money or something like that. And you can change a lot of variables. You can also observe if you stop them in the middle of the task and say, how do you feel now? Okay, before you've gotten the money, but when you think you might make money, how do you feel? And systematically we observe, this may not surprise you, but I don't know anybody else that showed it, that the more money people think they can make, the better they report feeling in that moment. And the more aroused they report feeling, okay? Now what you can do, though, and this is interesting, is you can actually scan them as they're doing those tasks and see what's going on in their accumbens and correlate. Say, you're anticipating making $5, and I am, too. And it just so happens that I'm really excited about making $5, and you're not, okay? Because you are flush with funds, and I am desperate, or for whatever reason. Then I can say, okay, did Brian have a bigger nucleus accumbens response than John? And the answer is yes. And so that doesn't, just the fact that people may not have phenomenological awareness or reflective capacity doesn't preclude the possibility that they could have it if they were paying attention to the right things. So I don't know if that clarifies things or not, but it's at least some data that's sort of relevant to the points or issues you're raising.
If the goal of the work that's being done is to figure out, to understand and then figure out ways of extending the reach of the compassion, altruism, empathy, does it matter whether it's quote-unquote pure? If we can identify a way of, for the vast majority of us, getting to the place where we all would like to see more people at, so what if it's related to providing stimulation in a certain area of the brain that the individual doesn't know is happening? I would contend it doesn't matter.
The reason it matters in terms of a definition, I think that one of the problems is just trying to generate the right research path here. And it's a very interesting suggestion that there are persons who are some of those outliers, for example, your Kantians that Bill Tierney noticed. They are maybe not, they may have established a behavior now that is so well established that they don't need, that the reward circuit doesn't go off. And therefore, and maybe that's the best route to establishing that form of behavior. Maybe that's the end point. In that case, the affective tone of the activity is irrelevant. If the person feels good or not, it's irrelevant. The Buddhist claim would be that the affective tone is actually going to be what determines whether or not this activity is in the long term healthy. And that engaging in an activity that is constantly that has a negative affective tone is going to be unhealthy and inhibits flourishing in the longer term. But also, I think it's very clear for us to uncouple the sort of moral question The Kantian issue is, morally, this activity can't be altruism because I know it's going to be a reward. But if in fact I can barely detect any kind of reward, then this term reward in the neurological sense is irrelevant to the definition of altruism as in the moral sense. That's the point.
I'm afraid we're going to have to detach ourselves from the rest of this conversation. I would like to do two things. One is I would like to give you my little insight here into this conference, at least how I've seen it. And, you know, it's been extraordinary to me that we've been able to bring all of you here on a number of levels. But the ability to bring people of goodwill from all these different disciplines who have an intent to look very deeply at some of these problems has really been quite amazing. And I hope each of you has enjoyed this conversation. It's interesting. I've spoken essentially to all of you, and maybe many of you are embarrassed to tell me otherwise. But without question, everyone said, boy, this is an extraordinary conference. The dialogue here has been at a level that typically is not seen in a scientific meeting, and I've had an opportunity to actually have a conversation with others outside of my silo, if you will, at a deep level to understand sort of about these fields and to learn more, which can imbue me with better insights into the work that I'm doing. So I hope that's been the feeling of all of you. And so on that level, I would like to thank you very much, and I hope we're all able to get together again to have further conversations. On that note, I would like to introduce another member of our executive committee, Tenzin Tethong. Tenzin is a distinguished fellow at the Institute, or the Stanford Tibetan Studies Institute, and he's also had a lifelong commitment to the issues related to Tibet, and is in fact the president of the Dalai Lama Foundation, on whose board I also serve. But in the background, although Tenzin is a very quiet individual, he is an individual of immense strength, and he has been able to do an immense amount in terms of the people of Tibet and starting a number of organizations to support not only the Tibetan people, but the Tibetan culture. And after His Holiness's visit, Tenzin was one of the voices who continued to speak out about the importance of the types of dialogues with neuroscientists that His Holiness was having, and I had the opportunity to meet him when I was searching out ways to stimulate interest in this project, and he's been since that time on our executive committee, and he's also a wonderful human being. So he is going to make a few comments, and Tenzin, without further ado.
Let's see, my final comments are going to be very brief, and my task is actually, it's very simple, but I think an important one. First and foremost, on behalf of CCARE, I have to thank all of you for being here today, especially the presenters, discussants, and those who've actively shared their thoughts with us today. So I would like to, formally thank every one of you. And in thanking you, we should also thank the original supporters and donors to this CARE initiative. It starts with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which for those of you who are not familiar, I should just state that, first of all, he doesn't generally give donations out because he doesn't have much to give, actually, on a personal level. He usually directs whatever donations come to monastic groups or orphanages or children's institutions. And the other part is, since his childhood, he was a public figure. So he never had a personal life, so to speak. So everything he did was either for Tibet or for Buddhism or for this group or that group. And the few areas where he had a personal life was tinkering with watches and small mechanical things, as some of you know. And as he grew up, this area of interaction with other spiritual figures, contemplatives, and his interaction with scientists, I think, became his pet personal project. So when the Stanford group went up to see His Holiness and gave him an update on what we were doing, his immediate reaction was, I'm going to give some money. And I think it basically comes from his book, Ethics for the New Millennium, and one or two other books that have sold fairly well. So it's I think, as a Tibetan, I think it's a very auspicious start to our project. And then with that, we want to thank Wayne Wu and Chad Meng Tan, who've been the initial supporters. And Dr. Doty, you also made this possible with your initial donations to the neurosurgery department. And for this conference, we want to thank Fester Institute. I believe we have a few representatives here. And then at Stanford, we want to thank Sinton. I can't spell out everything, but I think people know that. And we want to especially thank Joel for doing the bulk of the work, Joel Finkelstein. And I believe we've had considerable help from the Office of Medical Development, Vani and Lorraine, so we want to thank them for their help. Finally, on a personal level, I simply want to say that we've had a very distinguished and unusual group of people here, and there's no doubt that your professional and scholarly credentials are impeccable, but I know quite a few of you here, and we can't share everybody's story, but there is a group of very remarkable individuals here. And I think maybe, Jim, you brought it to the front when you last spoke. There's a sense of humanity here. We are not simply doing this for purely, shall we say, professional reasons or academic reasons or personal reasons. I think behind each one of us, I think we want to make a contribution to a better world. So I think that is, in a sense, what I feel, and I'm very proud to be part of this and to have this wonderful opportunity to thank all of you. Thank you.